When I was a kid, I went to a friend's house for a sleepover. It was an extremely hot day in the middle of the summer break, 2001. My friends and I were around 12 or so at the time, and we'd all been eagerly awaiting this night. There were 4 of us staying over in total. A pretty nice-sized event. We watched movies, ate inordinate amounts of junk food, played N64 games, the works. At around 11 p.m., my friend's parents told us it was time for lights out. But of course, we all secretly stayed up longer, keeping our voices low and the sound on the TV muted. We were playing the original Super Smash Bros., and the 4 of us were having a tournament. We agreed that whoever won the tournament could sleep in my friend's bed, while the rest of us had to sleep in sleeping bags on the floor. Catch was, whoever came in last had to sleep in the creepy spare bedroom on the first floor, all by themselves. For us, the stakes were high. That spare bedroom was on the other side of the house, down this horrible, pitch-black hallway. It had this eerie vibe to it, a sort of ghostly vibe. The stereotypical haunted room that terrifies a young mind. There was even a family rumor that one of the previous tenants had died in that room. Sharing staff. Not wanting to lose the tournament, I picked the character I was best with, Captain Falcon. We drew lots to see who'd face off against who, and it all culminated in a free-for-all match that was worth extra points. Luckily for me, I was able to Falcon kick and punch my way to victory. Our friend Jamie came in last. Unfortunately for him, he now had to make the walk down the dark hallway alone, and sleep in the supposedly haunted bedroom. He begged us not to make him go, but being young boys, we all told him that a deal's a deal, and that if he didn't go, he'd never live it down. He reluctantly scooped up his sleeping bag, quietly snuck out of my friend's bedroom, and nervously creeped through the hallway until he got to the spare bedroom's door. He slowly twisted the handle, entered, and closed the door behind him. That's the last any of us ever saw of Jamie. The next morning, when we went to check on him, we found the room completely empty, the window wide open. We told the adults that Jamie was gone, and they in turn called the police. According to them, the most likely scenario was that because it was a hot night, Jamie opened the window before going to sleep. At some point after that, someone came in through the open window and took him. Nobody else heard a thing, and none of the other neighbors saw anything either. To this day, we don't know what happened to Jamie, and I'm still waiting for updates. Looking back, I of course wish we hadn't made him go. I wish we'd made a different forfeit. We were young. It was an innocent day, and there's no way any of us could have foreseen what was going to happen. But still, I can't help but feel in some way responsible. I think about Jamie often, even to this day. He was a good kid, a good friend, and didn't deserve whatever happened to him. It took place in 1993 when I was a freshman at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. One day my friend Mark, who lived a few doors down the hall from my dorm, knowing of my appetite for ghost stories, came to the room brimming with excitement, with a story he couldn't wait to tell. Something had just happened to a friend of his that left him spooked. I don't remember the friend's name, but let's call him Frank. Frank was an architecture major. Architecture had a reputation as a really tough major, demanding countless hours of work in the studios, drafting, building models, and doing whatever else architects do. I would often walk back to North Campus after late night study sessions around midnight. All the buildings would be dark, all except the architecture school's Rand Hall, that is. Rand, with its wide panoramic windows, would always be brightly lit with silhouettes of students busily working on their projects inside. I thought I was out late, but the architects had many more hours ahead of them before they could even consider sleep. And so it was. Frank's experience was that of a typical architect, and he was up late one night working on his latest project. Around 3 a.m., he decided to call it quits and head home. Stepping outside, the chilly nighttime air of upstate New York gripped him. He made his way across the deserted bridge to North Campus, pausing briefly to take in the waterfall and the crumbling castle-like facade of a long-abandoned building in the gorge below. He continued to his dorm, appreciating the quiet emptiness of the campus at night, until he reached his dorm, High-Rise 1. which I believe is now called Jameson Hall. There were two entrances to high-rise one on the south and one on the north. Each entrance consisted of two sets of glass doors with a vestibule in between. The first door did not have a lock and could only be pulled open. The second door was locked and could only be opened by inserting a key, turning it to retract a spring-loaded bolt, and then pulling the door open while the key was turned. Only residents of the dorm were given the keys. As Frank was coming from the south, he naturally went to the south entrance. As he had done hundreds of times before, he went through the first door, inserted his key to open the second door. The key turned as usual, and he could feel the bolt retract, but the door would not open when he pulled it. He pulled and pulled, but it would not budge. He didn't understand what was wrong. There was no obvious obstruction, but figured there must be something wrong with the door. So he went around to the north entrance. He inserted his key in the second door, turned it, felt the bolt retract, but again could not pull the door open. That is when he looked into the lobby and saw a small, frail, elderly woman. A vacant expression hung on her sunken face. Long, stringy gray hair limped down the sides of her head, almost as if the hair was damp. She wore what appeared to be a nightgown. This sight struck Frank as highly unusual, if not a little creepy. Being a college campus, elderly people were never seen, especially not in a dorm, and especially not in the middle of the night. Frank reasoned that maybe she was just a student's grandmother visiting. Anyway, he needed help to get in, and she was the only person who could give it to him. So he knocked on the glass and asked her to come open the door. She didn't respond or acknowledge Frank in any way. He knocked louder and raised his voice. Still no response. Switching from his knuckles to his fists, he banged on the door and was all but yelling to get her attention. Finally, she started walking in slow, shuffling steps, but instead of moving toward the door, she approached the hallway leading to the laundry room. All this time, Frank had the key turned and was continually pulling on the door. The woman entered the hallway and continued forward until she disappeared from Frank's view. In that instant, the door flew open. Frank rushed in with relief, his anxieties about being unable to get into the dorm now gone. He turned his attention to the curiosity about the strange woman. He wanted to make sure she wasn't up to no good or maybe even in need of help, so he entered the hallway and followed it all the way to the laundry room. Nobody was there. There was no other path, no other exit. The woman had just vanished. A wave of goosebumps washed over him as he realized that he had just seen a ghost. In 2014, I attended a law enforcement academy in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Tullahoma is a small town near the Highland Rim. It was once known as the Barrens to the first white settlers of the area. The academy and its buildings were old pale stone and looked like a small college campus. Large halls surround the center grassy area, and a path led to other large stone buildings with classrooms, a dining hall, and outbuildings. The commandant had a large home, and if you didn't know the history of the place, you could almost believe that it was just a school. My husband's family hails from Tullahoma, so I already knew the academy where I'd be living for 3 months had once been a girls' vocational school, aka a prison, where juvenile girls would be sent. People with mental illness, learning disabilities, and other ailments would also be committed by their families or the courts. Many of the girls had serious mental health issues, and rather than getting any help, they were imprisoned. Part of our training included a tour of the facilities and a brief history of the grounds, and we were shown the old-timey jail cells that some of the girls were put into for misbehaving. One of the oldest instructors there told us that there were many incidents of violence, and one girl going mad and killing another student in a dorm. She was stabbed and thrown down the stairs of the residence hall. Purcell's, the story, and the fact that the prison trustees roamed the grounds doing yard work and other tasks in their prison-issued jumpsuits was unnerving. Each building in the place had a solitary, malignant vibe, and leaving that place every weekend was like escaping from a melancholy bubble. And going back took mental effort. No one wanted to be there. At the academy, men and women were separated in different halls. We were in McAllister Hall, and the guys were in Rye Hall. Each hall is a 3-story stone building with large central staircases, and McAllister Hall, where I was staying, had a massive old chandelier-style light fixture hanging in the center of the ceiling. The chandelier hung down in the center of the grand staircase, and each floor had a fire escape stairwell. At night, we'd gather and chat. It was claustrophobic in our tiny one-bed rooms, and we had gotten very friendly. I was in my room getting ready for bed when I heard a terrible commotion. I don't even know what I thought I was hearing. I just heard a terrible noise coming from my next-door neighbor's room. It sounded like arguing. Wondering what they could be arguing about at such a late hour, I rushed out into the hall, where I was met by others. We all arrived in time to hear a sick, thudding noise on the stairs heading to the 3rd floor. The huge chandelier hanging from the ceiling was swaying from side to side furiously. We just stood there and looked at each other in shock. The girls down the hall thought Katie and I were fighting. Some swore they heard someone falling down the stairs. I told them I heard 2 people arguing. All this time the chandelier kept swaying, and all 12 of us were really freaked out. Katie grabbed my flashlight and went up the stairs, but didn't go all the way up. It was dark, and not a soul was rooming up there. We called the men's hall and security. They came and walked upstairs, and the security guard didn't see anything. As the security guard left, he told us about the ghosts. A girl had killed another one on the 3rd floor by stabbing her and tossing her down the stairwell. They'd stuck her in a prison cell behind our classroom for days until she could be taken away by law enforcement. Our hall was the one the murder had occurred in. Scared now for sure, we decided to gather at the end of the hall as usual near the fire escape door. We were chatting about how scary the noise had been and how real it had been. We all heard the ghosts and believed the guard. We were discussing all the excitement when all of a sudden from behind us we heard a massive bang of something hitting the huge metal fire escape door. We jumped a mile into the air and looked at one another. Well, it couldn't get all 12 of us, and we were law enforcement professionals. So after some trepidation, we opened the door. The fire escape was blocked off, and no one was on the porch. This story is actually my father's, but he told it to me my whole life. As he knew my sisters and I were fascinated in the paranormal, I have never experienced anything. And I'm the type of person that loves hearing these stories, but would be terrified if they happened to me. My father grew up in Adelaide, Australia, which is quite a large city now. When my father grew up in the late 60s, a large majority of the town was bushland and open fields. If you have never been to Australia during the summertime, the heat can be unbearable and dry, sometimes hitting 47 degrees Celsius. And the bushland grass is wispy and sharp. Back then, my father used to push bike around everywhere, as his mother, my grandmother, was a nurse, and my grandfather was a truck driver. It was also just the normal thing for kids to do back in those days. This meant that my dad's friends were rather close to him, only a bike ride away through the open fields and scrub. Getting to my story, my father would often sleep over at his best friend Louie's house, as he lived just up the road from my dad. He could easily bike ride there, and they were childhood friends. The house was quite beautiful, and still stands today, but has been remodeled. It was a 2-story house built in the 50s or 60s. Unfortunately, as my father and his friend Louie were children, I don't know any of the backstory of the house, or who lived there previously. All my dad knew was The house was haunted, and although he enjoyed Miss Louie's company, he hated sleeping there. My father had always avoided scary things like horror movies or ghost tours whenever I went with my sisters and mother. I always thought he was just being a big scaredy cat. But now I think perhaps his childhood left a mark on him. When my father told me the stories, he would begin by saying it was haunted, or there was just something off about that place. It was only once he had had a few drinks did he tell me what really happened. And after that, he was more willing to talk about it. When he slept at Louie's house, they would sleep in bunk beds, and my dad would usually sleep on the top. The bedroom was on the second story of the house, and from the bedroom door, you could look down the hallway leading to the staircase. Then, as you went down the hallway, the staircase was on your left, leading to the bottom floor. One night my father was trying to get some sleep on the top bunk bed when he awoke to a strange noise. He swore he heard a knife chopping on the chopping board in the kitchen downstairs. As it was night time, and everyone was in bed in the house, it was dead silent. So he knew it wasn't any of the family members. Other nights he heard footsteps downstairs and upstairs, including the upstairs hallway where he was staring from the bedroom. Whenever my father spoke to Louis about the chopping board and the footsteps, Louis would shrug it off as if it was a normal occurrence. As time went on, my father noticed that Louis was covered in bruises. My father assumed it was a normal teenage boy roughhousing thing. But when he asked Louis about how he got the bruises, Louis explained that during the night, while he was sleeping, he would be shaken awake by something he could not see. He would wake up the next morning covered in fresh bruises that he couldn't explain. He would joke, saying he was getting beat up in his sleep by the ghost. My dad didn't think it was a joke, though. One night, my father and Louis decided to switch bunk beds for whatever reason, meaning my dad was on the bottom bunk. Again, during the night, my father began to hear footsteps throughout the house. He heard the footsteps go up the stairs and enter the hallway toward the bedroom. While lying there, he froze in fear as the footsteps approached the bedroom. Next thing he knew, my father was violently shaken while in his bed, as if someone was trying to push him with both hands toward the back of the bed. I'm not sure if he had bruises to show for it, but it terrified him. He began sleeping at Louis's house less after that. My father told me the paranormal disturbances continued in that house as the boys grew older, but they didn't really discuss it. The bruises continued with Louis, and the parents became increasingly concerned when the knives in the kitchen continued to move around. In the end, the family got a priest to bless the house. My father said they even went as far as to perform an exorcism on that house, which was a big deal in a little town like Adidale. They continued to live in that house, and Louis eventually moved out when he got older, as did my dad from his parents' house down the street. I've never known much to speak with my dad, as he is a true blue hardened man. However, this is not a story he enjoys telling, as when he tells it, it looks like he's reliving those memories again. Back in the beginning of the year, I took a job in West Texas, specifically around the Pecos-Orla area. I started working with a couple of my cousins and uncle out in the desert on a project, and roomed up with them in a house they rented out. It was all calm and well the first month or so, but all the way through to May, I experienced shadows out of my peripheral vision, and a sleeping paralysis episode that very well spooked me as well. Starting March, I began seeing small shadow figures peeking at me through the entranceway of the living room across from where I was sleeping. I'd see it peeking around the corner, and when I'd try to meet it eye to eye, it would be gone. Other times throughout the coming months, I'd catch a tall, slender shadow figure peek at me. I felt especially uncomfortable around that one. I had these encounters on and off, and when I mentioned it to my cousins and uncle, they asked me questions, but they dismissed it entirely, since they weren't being affected personally. Only my other cousin continued the conversation, and that was only because he had heard footsteps around the house when no one else was home. Little things like this continued until one night, I woke up and found myself in a state of sleep paralysis. I could only pivot my head. The air was still, and I could feel eyes of something glaring at me. I took a breath and calmed myself, but all too suddenly, I could see the shadow of the little kid and the tall one peeking around the corner. Then out of nowhere, I cannot stress this enough, an old disfigured man appearing levitating across from me. As much as I've gotten used to seeing shadow figures and sleep paralysis, there's always this sort of creeping feeling underneath my calm demeanor that always slips out once in a while. It overtook me for a second, but I calmly took control and told it to pass on, and that it did not belong there any more. But that did nothing. It simply just kept staring at me. After a minute, it evaporated into nothing, and I found myself moving again. It took a few minutes to recollect myself, and then I fell back to sleep. For the rest of the time I was there, nothing like that happened again. But the small things kept on happening from time to time. This is something that actually happened to me. This was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I was still living with my parents, and I had already graduated. I was a teenager that worked nights and had nothing better to do. So of course I always stayed up all night and slept most of the day until work. While I noticed odd things happened when mom and my siblings were gone, my dad worked nights as well, and was almost always home too, but sleeping as well for the next night at work. I began to notice I'd often wake up to what sounded exactly like my mom, or my dad yelling for me from downstairs. Of course I'd get up and be thinking Mom got off early or Dad just couldn't sleep. I'd come down the steps starting a convo, and literally no one would be there. I'd even pop open my parents' room to see if Dad was even up. Most of the time, he wasn't even awake. I often brushed it off thinking it was just me dreaming about one of them waking me up. You'll know. Well, one day I woke up to my mom calling my name. Same drill as before, but this time I couldn't get up. I couldn't even move. I could move my eyes to look around, but that was it. During the day, the sun would shine right into my room, so it was never dark. But this time, it was almost pitch black with only the slightest bit of light slipping through my window by my closet. I saw this shadow thing grinning in the darkness by my closet. It felt like an eternity that I laid there paralyzed with fear. I was being helped down. The moment I was able to move, I ran out of my room. As it turned out, my dad wasn't even home. He was out running errands and I was terrified. Not long after I had moved out, my father and I were at my grandmother's house and got on the track of paranormal experiences. While I had never told anyone about my experiences at home, my dad started telling his story, and it was literally the same as mine. He would hear my mom call his name, and no one would be home. He even described the thing that would hold him down as well. So glad I moved out. My father bought a farm place. Owning a farm was a big dream of his for many years, and at the time he bought the house, my partner and I were living there with our newborn, because we were very young, had bad credit, and almost no money. One night I was awakened by my daughter wanting to be fed. After I nursed her, I laid her back down, but couldn't get myself back to sleep. It was around 2 a.m. I decided to leave our bedroom to sit in the living room. I was sitting there for a while. Everyone else in the house was asleep. The house was completely silent. Suddenly, from the opposite corner of the living room, I heard a clear whistle directed at me. It was the type of whistle parents use to get their children's attention, the quick two-note one. I heard that out of nowhere and became lightheaded. I'm someone who believes in the paranormal, but I'd never experienced something for myself until that point. I was trying to find any explanation for what had happened, and to this day I still cannot think of a logical explanation. Other family members have had experiences not home as well, such as hearing footsteps, smelling cigarette smoke. No one in my family smokes. It's all very odd, but we are thinking it may be one of the previous owners. The farmland has been occupied since the 1860s, so I'm sure there are many people still wandering around. My ghost story takes place in a city about a half an hour from Palm Springs, California. The unexplainable events started after my family moved into a house that was seemingly a typical desert home. The house wasn't that old, built about 20 years ago, but it needed a lot of work. We purchased the house at a really good price, so we felt it was worth the sweat equity. The whole house needed to be renovated. Old peeling paint, The walls were dirty or scuffed up. Carpeting was old. Broken appliances. The previous owner must have been wheelchair-bound, since the carpet was stained with black marks that appeared to be from a wheelchair with dirty wheels. The tub in the master bathroom was also modified. One side of the tub was trimmed so a person could get in and out of the tub without having to raise their legs too high. The list of things that needed to be repaired was long. But my husband is really handy, so we were excited to get started. As soon as we got the keys, my husband got to work by removing the old dirty carpeting throughout the house. When we pulled up the carpeting from the living room and stood back, we were shocked to find a dark stain in the concrete. It appeared as if it was the shape of a body curled up in a ball. He showed the dark reddish stain to his mom, who was there since she was helping work on the house. She also agreed and remarked that the stain was very unusual. When I got home, my husband Jack showed me the stain, and I was surprised to see such an eerie stain under the carpet. I didn't want to think that anything morbid had happened in the house, so I just laughed it off and asked my husband not to mention anything to our younger daughter. The unexplainable events didn't end there. One night my family and I were watching a show in the living room, when suddenly our dog stood up and walked toward the hallway. The hallway was next to the living room, so we watched as he growled and barked at something he felt was an unwelcome visitor. We were frightened, since we never witnessed that behavior in him before, and we could not see what he was looking at. His growling and barking continued for a few more minutes, and yelling at him to stop barking had no effect. Sometime after that growling incident, I was alone with our dog Cash. Jack and my daughter, Ava, had gone to visit his mother for the day. I worked nights, so I needed to rest. It was sometime around 6 p.m., and I was making dinner for myself. I was expecting Jack and Ava to come home soon. The hallway was between the living room and the kitchen. There was no wall to separate the two rooms. Cash was lying on the floor next to my feet, as he always did, when suddenly he stood up and walked to the hallway. Even now, as I'm typing this, I'm getting the goosebumps. He started barking and growling like he was ready to attack. I turned my body around so I could face the hallway to see what he was barking at. I saw him in an attack posture, looking up at something at the end of the hallway. I looked to see what he was looking at, but saw nothing. I was so scared that I pleaded with him to stop. I finally ran outside and called Jack and asked him when he was going to come home. I was so relieved when he said he was almost home. This last event was the most disturbing, since it seemed the spirit was evolving or becoming bolder. I was in our bedroom with Jack, and we were talking about our day. I think I needed something in the hallway bathroom, so I began walking there as it continued to talk. I stopped in the hall bath and proceeded to ask him a question. As I was talking, I saw him pass me by in the hallway. I waited for him to respond, but thought he didn't hear me, so I yelled out to him, "Jack, did you hear me?" This time he replied back, but I heard his voice coming from back in the master bedroom. I suddenly realized that whoever passed me by in the hallway was not Jack. I ran to our bedroom and asked him if he had followed me into the hallway and passed me by. He said he never left our room. After that incident, I realized there was a spirit in our home, and the spirit was now appearing to us. There were a few more incidents that occurred in that home during the 2 years living there. One night, my family and I were in bed sleeping, and our ring alarm was triggered in our master closet. It didn't make sense for the alarm to go off since the closet doors were closed, and we were all sleeping. This caused me to think back on when the activity started and slowed down. I heard ghosts are disturbed when renovations occur, and it seemed to be right. That since the spirits were most active was when the home projects were going, and our last few months were pretty quiet, and that's because the renovations had slowed down. So when all these unexplainable events occurred, we started to search for answers. We found the previous owner's driver's license in a kitchen drawer, so we searched the obituaries to see how he passed away. Unfortunately, his name didn't pop up in the search. Our neighbor told Jack that the previous owner used to go outside the house in his underwear or naked under his robe. One strange thing I wanted to add was when Jack began a demo on the house, he found screws all over the house in random places. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you there were hundreds of them. Everywhere you looked, there were screws. The doorway, doors, the garage floor, outside the stucco walls, etc. It seemed that at the end of his life, he must have gone crazy. It was a typical workday morning, rushing to get myself and my 5-year-old son ready for work and preschool while putting on my makeup. I heard a voice in my head clearly say, "Call your mom." I shook it off and thought I'd call her when I got to work. A couple of minutes passed, and then I heard the voice in my head again say, "Call your mom." Once again, I thought I'll definitely call her when I get to work. Please note that this was before cell phones. A couple of minutes passed again, and this time the voice said, "Call your mom now." It really shook me up. I immediately called my mom. "Hi Mom, it's Cindy," my mom said. "What do you want? I'm getting ready for work and I need to leave." I said, Nothing. I just need to talk with you for a couple of minutes." And she said, "Are you sure? Are you okay?" "I need to be on time for work." Her voice was getting more agitated. And I said I was fine. I just needed to stay on the phone for a minute. My mom said, "Cindy, I don't have time for this. I'm hanging up the phone." I thought about calling her back, but knew it would really make her mad. So I got ready to go to work. I had been at work about 5 minutes when I got a call from my mom. "Cindy, it's Mom." Her voice sounded shaken. "If you hadn't called me this morning, I would have been hit by a train just 1 minute sooner, and I would have been killed." Dr. Patrick Cronin was born in Cork, Ireland, and came to the US as an infant. Over the years, he earned his doctor's degree and practiced medicine in the Chicago area. He also became involved in Irish politics. He became critical of an Irish organization based out of the US that seemed to be committing terrorist acts against England with monies donated by Irish Americans. The organization denied the accusation, but yet Irish members in America who protested were expelled from the organization. Dr. Cronin was one who came forward and criticized the board, and he was dubbed a traitor and expelled. Cronin continued with his accusations against the board, and Sullivan, one of the leaders and a lawyer in Chicago, was overheard saying that he wished Cronin could be removed. The murder. On May 4th, 1889, Cronin got a knock on the door. A man in a carriage asked for his assistance, that an employee of O'Sullivan had been injured. Cronin begrudgingly accepted. He grabbed his bag, climbed aboard the carriage, and was never seen alive or heard of again. A few weeks later, on May 22nd, the Public Works received complaints that something was jamming up the sewer and there was a terrible odor emanating from it. Public Works went to clear the sewer and discovered the body of Dr. Cronin. The murder scene was eventually found in a small cottage behind an ice house on O'Sullivan's property. In the end, 3 people, including O'Sullivan, were convicted of the murder and imprisoned for life. By 1891, the cottage where the murder took place was being used by Mr. and Mrs. Carlson. And in the early summer of 1891, residents in the vicinity of the cottage where the murder took place began hearing strange noises and seeing strange things, which led many to believe Dr. Cronin's ghost was haunting the cottage. A few people said they actually saw a ghost of the dead doctor looking out the windows of the cottage. But it all began on June 18th, when Mrs. Carlson, who lived at the cottage with her husband, was awakened by strange cries, moans, and the sound of feet moving about. On that same night, someone else said they saw a ghostly form, enveloped in a white shroud, appear at one of the windows in the front room, and peering out of the window, the ghost let out moans and cries. The ghost was described as having the head and shoulders of a man, with features that were distorted in pain and anguish. The stories began to spread around the neighborhood very quickly, and people gathered to watch every night, wondering if the ghost of Dr. Cronin haunted the cottage. Miss Jenny Silva said she saw the strange white indistinct form through the window. She brought her friend, Miss Taft, who knew Dr. Cronin, to see if she could identify the face. But the face was too indistinct. Another gentleman, Joseph E. Specht, a florist, who lived nearby at 1198 Lincoln Avenue, was also a spiritualist. He said he felt Cronin return to the living to point out other accomplices to his murder. He volunteered spending the night in the cottage to make contact with the dead doctor and to pass on any messages along to friends. Two men who spent the night in a streetcar for a paving company said they could see the house from where they were at night, and they had seen lights in the front windows and strange, uncanny reflections. Mr. Carlson, who lived there with his wife, had become so frightened of the ghost that he requested the presence of a police officer at night, because he was afraid for his life. When Mrs. Carlson was about to share more information about the ghost with the press, Mr. Carlson hushed her. For weeks, the neighborhood buzzed at midnight as curious onlookers watched for the ghost of the murdered Dr. Cronin. I live in Pennsylvania now, but prior to this, I lived in Massachusetts and grew up in Texas. We moved a lot growing up, so we had a lot of houses that were haunted. Thankfully, I'd never seen anything. I don't think I'd ever recover if I did. I have many stories I've heard over the years growing up. It's a favorite pastime in my family to share and recount ghostly encounters. So as a kid, I'd often be sent off to bed with them fresh in my mind. Thankfully, I shared a room with my two sisters for most of my life. I've never been able to tell if a creepy feeling was due to actual paranormal presences, or if it was just me being creeped out. Anyway, as I said, I have many stories, but I want to share a few that I actually witnessed. We were living in a suburb of Houston, and I was a junior or senior in high school. The house and the neighborhood itself wasn't very old, only about 25 years old or so, and we had moved in about 4 years earlier. It was a cute house, 3-bedroom ranch, wooded lot, and the neighborhood was dense, and neighbors were never more than 50 feet in any direction. I don't know the history of the house or who lived there before we moved in. At the time, I finally had a room to myself, as my grandmother and older siblings had all moved on, so it was just myself and my little sister left. I promptly moved into the new empty room and relished the solitude. Nothing really happened for a long time while I was there, to me anyway. That is, until my sister moved in with us, while she waited for her house down the street to close. She had set up some blankets on the floor of my room, right next to my bed. The room was square, and I had my bed in the far corner, diagonally opposite the door. Right next to the door, and on the right, if you were looking at it from the inside, there was a door to the closet. I had set up my bed at an angle, so the foot of the bed was not against the wall, but in the middle of the room. My sister had her blankets tucked into the side between my bed and the door. All was well when we turned out the light for bed. I'm not sure what time it was, certainly in the middle of the night, because the house was quiet and everyone had gone to bed. I woke up because I felt someone grab my foot and shake it, as if trying to wake me up. When I woke up, there was no one there. I looked around the room. It was very dark, and I could just make out the objects in the room. I saw the form of my sister sleeping next to my bed. Freaking out, I turned on my bedside lamp. There was nothing, and my sister began to rouse from having the light on, and she was pretty grumpy. I whispered to her, "Did you just grab my foot?" "No, what's going on? Turn off the light," she said, obviously annoyed. "Someone just grabbed my foot and shook it to wake me up. I thought it was you." "I was asleep. Now turn off the light and let me sleep." She had no sympathy. Now I was really freaked out. I told her there was no way I was turning out the light, and she could put a pillow over her head if she wanted dark. She grumbled and did just that. I didn't sleep a wink after that. I just lie there, scanning the room, until I heard my mother wake up the next morning. It was the longest night. And when I told everybody the next day, they all shrugged it off as it wasn't anything new for them. They made spooky noises and wiggled their fingers at me, but that was it. For a while after that, I read until I fell asleep each night, so I wouldn't have to think about it, and I'd compromised my little sister to let me have a little light on. Nothing like that has ever happened to me again, thankfully. I've had enough shenanigans in my life without the paranormal contributing. My next story took place in the same house. I can't remember if it took place before or after the last story, but that's not really relevant. I will explain the layout of the house. As you walked in the front door, to your left was a short wall, behind which was the kitchen. If you went straight, it led to the living room. If you turned right, there was a hallway, which ended in a half bath and turned left to the bedrooms. All the floors were linoleum except the bedrooms. We had a large dining table in the eat-in kitchen, which jutted out past the short wall that separated the kitchen from the foyer. If you were sitting at the end of the table, you could see into the foyer, but not quite the front door, unless you leaned over a bit. For some reason we had visitors. My cousins, uncle, and aunt were staying with us. As per usual, we were all crowded around the table, laughing and talking. It was the middle of the day. Suddenly, my uncle, mother, and sister stopped, got quiet, and my mother and uncle, who were facing it, stared into the foyer. Shortly, everyone else noticed, and after a few seconds asked what was wrong. The three of them looked shocked and veiled. My mother grabbed my uncle's arm and said, "Did you see?" "Yeah," he said dryly. My sister, who was sitting with her back to the foyer, "I heard something that sounded like footsteps." "Yeah," both my mother and uncle confirmed. My uncle explained very slowly and quietly that he heard the footsteps coming down the hallway and looked up to see a little girl peeking around the wall, as if to see what the noise was about. My mother confirmed the same. We all sat in silence for a minute and wondered who this little girl could be and why she was visiting us. More recently, while living in Massachusetts, my then boyfriend, now husband, and I were making the big leap to find a place together. We found an amazing deal for a 2-level, 3-bed, 2-bath apartment that had recently been renovated. It had been the landlord's childhood home, and they turned it into 2 apartments. Within the first few weeks of living there, I noticed when I got home or was home alone, I would hear walking above me. That was odd, as the upstairs was carpeted, and this sounded like someone walking on hardwood floors. It was loud, and the first time I heard it, it did kind of freak me out, and I told my boyfriend about it, and he came in. He decided that it was probably just echoes from the people downstairs. I wasn't 100% convinced, as we didn't hear this all the time. Most of the time, the upstairs felt just fine. And I did spend time up there knitting and watching my shows, working on sewing projects, or getting ready for work in the mornings. But sometimes, it was downright creepy, and I would just grab what I needed and get out of there. On one occasion, the downstairs bathroom was being retiled, and we had to use the tiny upstairs shower. I couldn't get out of there fast enough, and the next night decided I could skip a shower for one day. Nothing happened, but I felt as if something was not happy that I was in that shower. I have a ring that I wear on my right hand, and I rarely take it off. Just a simple band, but somehow it's one of my favorites. I'd taken it off because I was going to make a meatloaf and didn't want to get it in the mess. I put the ring on the windowsill, made the meatloaf as usual. After dinner I was cleaning up and remembered my ring, only it wasn't there on the sill anymore. I told my boyfriend, and together we tore apart that kitchen, even the meatloaf. We went through the trash piece by piece. I was devastated. That had happened on a Friday evening, and the whole weekend I was mourning the loss of my ring. I silently put out a plea for it to be returned. Early Monday morning I went upstairs as usual to get ready. I walked into the bathroom to get ready, and there, sitting plain as day on the sink counter, was my ring. I was dumbfounded. How had that happened? I had not been up there to the 3rd floor since I left work that Friday morning. I had no reason to go up there, so it didn't happen. My boyfriend didn't believe me, but I know I didn't put it there. I distinctly remember my thought process of taking it off and putting it on the windowsill. I believe it was whoever I heard walking upstairs all the time up there. My last story is a family story from a previous house in South Texas. It was an old frame house my family was renting. All the houses on the street dated from 1930 to the 1950s. Shortly after moving in, my uncle came to stay and occupied the back bedroom. After moving in, he described how he would hear the attic access door open. Then he would hear something jump down, open the closet door, and walk around the room. All he could see was a pair of military-looking boots. And he never heard or saw it go back into the attic. While this didn't happen every day, it happened often enough that it was finally the norm. And my uncle named the ghost T.C. McForster. Nothing malicious ever came of it. Perhaps that's why my family was able to just live with it, even though it was creepy. I wonder if my uncle came up with the name from the ghost itself. Perhaps that was his name and rank. I have no idea about military ranks or abbreviations, nor do I know the history of that old house. Our family wasn't there for long, and it would just be added to the list of family ghost stories. And this is a famous story, and it's about a haunted house in New York that hit the news pretty big time, and it became actually kind of a legally haunted house. My dad was from Ireland and had a very tough upbringing back in the 1930s and 40s. He was in foster care from birth with a wonderful woman called May. He said his life in her cottage on the Irish coast was idyllic, as she was such a caring and loving person. One day when my dad was around 7 years old, his friend's mother told him that he'd be staying at their house for the night, as his Auntie May needed to go away. In the early hours of the morning, my dad heard knocking on the bedroom window. It woke him up, so he looked out, and he saw his Auntie May waving at him. He assumed that she was calling him to come home, and he quickly got dressed to leave. But he was stopped by his friend's parents, who tried to send him back to bed. They opened the door, at his insistence, to find no Auntie May. May had actually been hit by a motorbike while she was crossing the road, and she died overnight in the hospital. Later that morning, my dad was told that his precious Auntie May had gone to heaven. My dad had seen her and didn't believe that she'd gone, but he had to go back into the foster care system. This meant going back to the city in an industrial school, institutions for orphan boys, and later on in life a seminary, a softer option for orphaned boys who said they'd consider the priesthood. Years before emigrating to England, he took a visit to the coastal town that held so many happy memories for him. He went to a cottage and just hovered around smoking cigarettes. Eventually a woman came out of the cottage and they chatted. Eventually the woman asked my father if she knew anything about the ghost. The woman had several children at home, and for every child, an older lady had walked into the bedroom and left through a non-existent door. She never felt afraid of this lady, just a little sad. My dad always thought that ghost may have been his beloved Auntie May that made his early childhood so wonderful. I hope they're together again. Next up is a story from Michelle in Buckeye, Arizona. Hallway Shrieker. I live in Buckeye, Arizona, in a newish home built in 2004. About 8 years ago, I was on a work schedule that had me waking up at 3:30 a.m. each morning to catch a 5:30 a.m. bus. One particular morning, I woke up at 1 o'clock and could not fall back to sleep. This was very annoying because I was so tired. By 1:30, I was frustrated that I was still wide awake. Suddenly, I heard a horrific, inhuman shriek that emanated from the hallway just outside of my bedroom door. I absolutely froze, except for my heart, which was pounding away. The shriek only lasted a second, but it was long enough to terrify me. After a few seconds of silence, I prayed and worked up the courage to turn on the light, and I grabbed my gun. Even though I knew it was not going to be of any use against what I heard in that hallway. I looked down and saw one of my dogs, a rowdy little border collie mix, standing next to the bed with her tail tucked as tight as she could, and she was shaking hard. In a way, I was glad to see her reaction, because that meant I wasn't the only one who heard that thing shriek. I stood up and headed for the hallway, turning on every light as we went. There was nothing to see in the hallway, nor was there anything in the rest of the house. One of my cats was hiding under the dining table, all puffed up, so I assumed she had experienced it also. After the house was blazing with every light on, I searched for the dog and cat, both boys. They were sound asleep. Lucky little brats. Us girls were still freaked out. Apparently, animals are like people, and not everyone is able to experience the paranormal. I didn't feel anything odd or evil at that point, but the shrieking thing was certainly nothing good, looking back. I wonder if the anger I was feeling for not being able to fall back to sleep is what drove that thing to my home. Never had anything like that happen before or since. Hazel Bryan McGrew was born on August 8, 1896, in Brookfield, Missouri, as Hazel Donaldson. The Donaldson family eventually moved from Missouri to Iowa, and that was where Hazel met and married Guy Alexander McGrew. Hazel was 30 and Guy was 47. The couple went on to have 3 children, Thomas, otherwise known as Tommy, Robert, and Beverly. By 1940, Guy's occupation was a stationary fireman. That job entails operating equipment such as steam engines, generators, motors, turbines, and steam boilers. The couple rented a home at 296 8th Street in Des Moines, Polk, Iowa. The home they lived in is no longer there. It's a business district with high-rise buildings now. In 1942, their son Tommy was 8 years old. And on May 25th of that year, Tommy was on his way to a carnival. He reached the corner of First and Court, and a 16-year-old East High School student, who was unnamed, was driving by and saw him. The teenager asked Tommy where he was headed, and Tommy told him that he was going to the carnival. The driver told Tommy he would give him a ride to the carnival. So Tommy climbed into the car, but instead of taking Tommy to the carnival, he took him to the west side of Riverview Park, pulled over, and told Tommy to commit an immoral act. When Tommy refused and began crying out, the teenager began to punch him and choke him. Tommy climbed out of the car to get away, but not before the teenager hit him with a club. A state game warden heard Tommy's cries for help and pursued the teen's car. After about a 3-mile chase that was joined by a motorcycle policeman, at times reaching 70 miles an hour on city streets, the chase ended and the 16-year-old was arrested. Tommy survived, but had some severe injuries, and he was able to identify the suspect when he was in the hospital. And you can see a photo of Tommy at the hospital when I post this episode at anythinggoes.com. The following year, in 1943, the McGrew family moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where Guy McGrew began working at Hargrave Construction Company. And that's a company that appears to have been primarily doing asphalt repaving work. They'd been running ads in Cedar Rapids. Guy McGrew's gradual decline. On July 3, 1951, Guy, still employed by the Hargrave Construction Company, was working on resurfacing Highway 150 North when a truck driven by Albert Slavskoski backed into him. The collision knocked Guy to the ground, and he broke his hip. As a result, he was unable to continue working. By 1953, Guy was still disabled from the broken hip, so in June of that year, he sued the driver for $15,000, which would be about $150,000 today. 7 years later, Guy and Hazel were living at 1215 M Street in Cedar Rapids, and on Wednesday, July 20th, 1960, Guy McGrew passed away after a long illness. He was buried at the Linwood Cemetery in Iowa. At that time, her daughter had married and moved to California, and her 2 sons remained somewhere in Iowa. After her husband's death, Hazel moved to an apartment complex known at the time as the Mitchell Apartments at 511 A Avenue Northeast. It was a low-income 3-story building with 14 units that had been converted from a 3-story house. Each unit had to share a bathroom. There was 1 bathroom on each floor. There were many safety and fire violations that apartment building broke, partly because building codes had been overlooked after World War II in 1945. And that was because there had been a housing shortage. Construction had nearly halted during the war, but when soldiers returned, a shortage began. As such, ordinances and laws were often overlooked so people could have a place to live. And of course, the property owners were eager to pick up the extra money. So to sum it up, the 20-year-old makeshift apartment building where Hazel lived had become a slum building. And from what I understand, there were many in that area of Cedar Rapids. And actually, there had been other deaths around that time because of those apartments. Hazel, now living as a widow in an apartment on the top floor of the 3-story slum building, began a routine of visiting the Cedar Rapids Public Library. At that time, the library was located at the corner of 5th and 3rd Avenue, and it was only a 5-minute walk from her apartment on Avenue A. She went to the library so often that the staff knew her by name. On the evening of Tuesday, October 9th, 1962, sometime around 10:45 p.m., a smoker tossed their cigarette into a pile of rubbish that was scattered at the rear entryway of the Mitchell apartment building. Fire ensued. It appears the person had grabbed a nearby garden hose in an attempt to put out the flame, but he or she quickly left after the flames got out of control. A few minutes later, a man leaving the Alps Club across the street saw the flames climbing the rear of the apartment building. He ran back inside the club and called the fire department. The makeshift apartment building had an open stairway that led to Hazel's apartment, and when the fire started in the rubbish and began burning fiercely, the smoke billowed up the stairs and filled her apartment. The flames eventually managed to burn through the ceiling of her apartment, but they never entered the room where she was sleeping. Frank Mackenzie and his wife, who lived across the hall from Hazel, smelled the smoke and opened their door to try to warn Hazel of the fire. They yelled, but the smoke and flames were too intense, so they shut their door and climbed outside to the fire escape. The fire escape only took them down to the 2nd level, where they had to wait until they could be rescued by the fire department. The fire department arrived just after 11 p.m. and attempted to reach Hazel's apartment, but the flames were just too hot and they were unable to enter. In the meantime, rescues were being put forth on other tenants yelling from windows, like the Mackenzies. By the time the fire department was able to reach Hazel's apartment and transport her, she was found to be dead on arrival at the hospital from smoke inhalation. 2 firemen at the scene were also admitted to the hospital for smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Hazel McGrew was dead 1 year, 3 months after her husband's death. She was 66 and was buried next to her husband at the Linwood Cemetery. Wednesday, October 10th, 1962. On their drive into work that morning, the Cedar Rapids Public Library staff may have heard the #1 song, Sherry by the Four Seasons. The temperature in Cedar Rapids on that day was predicted to be 87. So when they arrived at the library and walked from their cars to open up, it was already getting warm outside. Later that morning, 3 library employees were coming down from the balcony where the newspapers were stored. They noticed Hazel McGrew. She was in the library as usual. They thought nothing of it because she became a regular fixture at the library. But in the afternoon, the staff was stunned when they saw an article on the front page of the Gazette, "Woman Dies in Apartment House Fire." And in the 2nd paragraph, the article stated that Hazel McGrew, 66, was dead on arrival at St. Luke's Hospital. It was then that the library staff realized they had seen the ghost of Hazel McGrew, who had died the evening before in a fire, visiting the library one last time. I'm unsure if the building was condemned after the fire. I know the mayor was very upset about the broken violations, and I read that the re-occupancy of the apartments was not permitted under its present condition. It would also appear that prior to this fire that caused Hazel's death, the city council had refused to move forward with stricter building and fire codes to end those kinds of buildings. But after Hazel's death, the mayor used her death, and 2 other very recent similar ones, as I said, and they were on the same avenue, to push the city hall into more stringent building codes and allow fire inspections. After visiting the slum apartments and seeing the lack of sanitation, among other violations, the mayor was quoted as saying, "It's my opinion that the people ought to be able to live like human beings. But whatever happened in the end, at some point over the years, the slum apartment building was torn down, and a brick church was built on the lot. The Cedar Rapids Public Library has since been moved to a new location. Hazel's ghost never made another appearance at the library, but it seems her death helped stop future disasters in Cedar Rapids, like the Mitchell Apartment slum fire on October 9th, 1962.